I'm Giselle. I'm so excited to be here. I am the co-author of the recently published Arc of Taste book, which is right here. And this book is really exciting. It's very colorful. It profiles a great many Arc of Taste foods from the United States and also has a number of recipes in it. So it is commonly referred to as a cookbook, but I would say it's more a collection of short stories with recipes peppered in. And I love this because I love all of this in keeping with the book because I am so inspired by singular ingredients and much of my cooking stems from that. So I have today a Long Island cheese pumpkin in front of me that I actually managed to grow in my garden. And so I tend to start with an ingredient and then decide what's for dinner from there instead of the other way around. And this book, I think, is great fodder for that if that is your practice or you want to try that. If you're getting a CSA and you pull something out of there that you have never seen before and don't know what to do with, we love this. You can turn on your curiosity and explore what to do with this one thing. So I will often open 6 different cookbooks and look at all of the recipes with a single ingredient in them and then decide what I want to do with it. Sometimes I do my own thing, sometimes I do one of those things. So I'm excited to encourage you to do the same. I think CSAs are pure magic for so many reasons, but one big reason is that they introduce us to new foods and then we can fall in love with those foods and then become very agile with them. Squash, I love squash, so much. All squash. I do have some favorites. I will admit that the Long Island cheese pumpkin is rather new to me in cooking. But I think squash is generally pretty interchangeable. So if you have a good kind of lineup of squash recipes that you like, that are kind of easy to jam, it's just throw in a new one, see what it tastes like. The texture tends to change a lot from one squash to another. So I find some are really great for soup. Some are great if I want to throw it into a hummus. Some are better to chop and roast and eat as pieces. Some of them have a grainier texture, some of them are a little more moist. So I think you do you, but I would encourage you to just chop it, roast it, see what it tastes and feels like, and then decide how you want to integrate it into your recipes or whatever it is you like to make at home with squash. Today we're gonna make a risotto with this guy. There is a risotto, a Long Island cheese pumpkin risotto recipe in the book by Fabrizio Faccini, who is a friend and a great, wonderful part of the Slow Food USA world. And I got to meet him many times and hang out with him. He is a wonderful Italian living in New York, has restaurants, an excellent chef. And also I love his recipes and his approach because it feels very kind of easy. And the whole drive behind it is these are meals you can make at home for you and your family, as he does, and then he kind of elevates that to take into the restaurant. But I'm gonna make a sort of a version of his risotto recipe from the book. And just like I mentioned previously, you can swap out any squash, I think, that you love. The Long Island cheese pumpkin is reputed to be the best squash for pie. I hear this over and over and over again. So what I hear from that is that it's sweet and it's smooth and creamy. So obviously lends itself well to risotto because we want those characteristics in risotto. I am not a professionally trained chef. I have logged very many hours in the kitchen. I would sometimes refer to myself as an advanced home cook. So you will see the techniques I use today may not be what you see from somebody who is professionally trained, but you and me, we're probably on the same page there. What I want to empower you all to do is kind of be able to look at a recipe and trust your gut and do it the way you're gonna do it, swap out ingredients. It took me a lot of years of following it exactly before I felt comfortable kind of going my own way. We're gonna combine squash and cheese and broth, and you can't really go wrong there. So I would say don't worry too much about getting it exactly right or following the recipe precisely. Risotto, I think, tends to sound or seem like an intimidating dish, but it's actually pretty easy. I think it requires some time and vigilance. You don't want to leave it on the stove. You will lose it, it will burn. But I love risotto. You can make it with rice, Fabrizio has a rice in there called carnaroli. I don't know if I'm saying that name right. That was hard for me to find, so I'm using the classic arborio rice today. I think a medium grain, you know, arborio is a great one to go with. It's always easy to find. We're gonna start with simply, so we peeled this one, it looks like that to start. This squash was sort of originally cultivated by indigenous people on the eastern seaboard. So it's been in the country for a long time. And some people say it looks like a cheese wheel, but I mean, cheese wheels are not ridged, so I don't know about that. But it's part of this family of squash, of which the butternut squash is a part, but they obviously look super different. They originate in Guatemala, and so they somehow made their way up to the northeastern United States. And indigenous people, as many of you will know their way around some squash and grow them really, really well and use them in tandem with other vegetables really, really nicely, or other things, legumes, vegetables. So I'm just gonna cut that up. We're gonna roast this off real quick. There are so many ways to roast squash. It's really hard to like burn it to a crisp because there's so much moisture in it. I really like the way Fabrizio recommends because it will retain more moisture. Most of the time I just chop it open, or pro tip, if you have a very large thick-skinned squash, drop it on the sidewalk and just let it crack itself open. Do not try to go at it with a knife. It's not worth the risk. This is not very thick-skinned, so it's easy enough to cut it open. And I'm gonna grab some foil. If you're just roasting squash to eat like as cubes, we're gonna puree this. So we want it to be a little watery so that it's easier to puree, and like there's a lot of flavor in that water. Obviously squash holds a lot of water, so putting it in foil will kind of steam it a little bit instead of letting all that water cook off. A little bit of olive oil. This is like a good moment to add a lot of olive oil. So we cut our squash, whatever squash you got, give it a little salt. Actually, we're kind of going through 3 different ways to cook your squash in this one. So we're gonna start with closing this down. And I'm really gonna seal it up so that it kind of steams and retains the moisture and flavor and all the good stuff. Make a little squash envelope. And then after 10-15 minutes, when it starts to get soft, I'm gonna open it up and broil it. So just like get it really hot, and then we're gonna throw it in the pot with some broth, which you could do any of those 3 things on their own. It doesn't really matter how you cook the squash. I find that if you just do kind of open face, if you will, roasting, you're gonna get crispier edges, you're gonna lose a little moisture, but you get that kind of candied quality, which is really tasty. And then if you just put it in a pot and cook it that way, it takes a while, and then it's very watery. Of course, we're using the broth in this recipe, so that works really well. But if you aren't keeping the water you're cooking it in or the broth you're cooking it in as part of your recipe, I would go with roasting in one of these 2 ways, or both. So I'm gonna put this in the oven at 375. These squash are quite large, and maybe some of the squash you have in your CSA is quite large. I think it's awesome to puree a whole squash and then use it for several different things over the course of a week or whatever. Like, don't keep it in your fridge for too long, but it's, you know, if it's autumn or winter, you can make a risotto, you can make a frittata, you can make a soup. Like, just go ahead and puree it, cook and puree all of it at once, and then keep it in jars in your fridge. And then you sort of have this like ready ingredient. So instead of only cooking off and pureeing half of your squash, then you still have to deal with the other half at some other point. So do yourself a favor and just call it good food prep for the week. In this recipe, it calls for shallots, which I love. I also really love a cipollini onion, which is what this is. I'm not sure what the variety, cipollini is like, has varieties within it. I'm not exactly sure what this is, but I got it at my fave farmer's market. I really love the flavor of a cipollini. I just like this really satisfying little shape. So I think whatever kind of small onion you have in your CSA is great. And again, I'm gonna have 2 of them ready to go. Again, this is gonna be like I think these smaller onions tend to be a little bit pungent depending on their freshness and depending on the variety. but it's a flavor I really love. I think that one of the things I really like about risotto and this recipe is it's kind of use what you have. I think you need the right rice, but generally speaking, like if you don't have a shallot or a chipotle, you could just use onion. That's fine. I'm gonna chop it pretty tiny because it's gonna go it's not gonna get any smaller than that. It's just gonna go right into our risotto from the top. Here's my rice. Another tip that I was given a long time ago, which I do with all rice, is rinse it. So use a little strainer and rinse it. The main reason for this is, I believe, to wash off some of the starches so it doesn't all want to stick together. In this case, we want it to be creamy, but if you've ever cooked rice that you don't want to be creamy, that is a side to your salmon or whatever, and it's kind of all one clump, probably you didn't rinse it, and so that like coating makes it want to all stick together. So just rinse your rice before you cook it, and it will make it come apart a little bit better. This is 2 1/4 cups of arborio rice. Again, I think you can play around with what rice you like to use. I also like to make risotto with farro. Tried that out one day and it worked really, really well. You can use a lot of different grains for risotto. Risotto makes an excellent side dish or a main dish. Like there's nothing wrong with just eating a bowl of risotto, no matter what they say. With maybe something yummy and crispy and salty on top. So we had our squash in the oven for a little while. It's nice and soft. It's like pretty soft, which is fine. I'm gonna open it up and broil it for 5 minutes, a la Fabrizio's recommendation. And you can see there's still like lots of water. It's kind of sitting in its own water, which is great. Throw it back in for 5 minutes or less on broil. So super hot, most of the heat coming from the top. Keep a close eye on your broil because it's real hot and works real fast. And like I said, I think you could skip any of these steps. You could make puree out of that right now. Just put it directly in the pot. You could cook it the whole time in the stock and then just puree it in there. It's all gonna work kind of just the same. I think the oven steps give it a slightly different flavor, a slightly more roasty flavor, which is tasty. And especially for a squash that's high in sugar, or anything that's high in sugar, which lots of squash is, then you get that like kind of candied, roasty flavor. That's really nice. So that's why we're going with that. This is kind of the perfect risotto pan, shallow and wide. You can use whatever you have. You can use a big Dutch oven. You're just gonna reach in there a little more than you might in one of these. Otherwise, I'd say go for a pot, so that you can pour your broth in and all of your bits without any problem. We're gonna put a whole stick of butter in here, because why wouldn't we? If any of you out there are lovers of risotto, I'm sure you know that it involves a great deal of butter. I think if you, I am not vegan, but I'm sure there are some great vegan options you could swap this out for. It's just a good fat. But for today, we're gonna start with 1 whole stick. That squash I used is just shy of 4 pounds. I'm using 2 1/4 cups of rice. So if you are kind of at half that, if you're just 1 cup of rice and a smaller squash, start with a half a stick of butter and a little less butter. Trying not to be too specific about the quantities, because I actually think aside from, and with this, most of the time when you make rice, you want to be pretty specific about your liquid and your rice. In this case, we're going to be slowly adding the liquid, so you'll be able to see and taste its progress and add more or less. And I love that about risotto, is it's really like, if you stay on it and pay close attention, you don't really need super specific quantities. The butter is making it creamy and fatty and sweet, but you can just throw in the amount of butter you desire. We're gonna cook off our onions in there to start, and then I'm gonna add a little bit of wine to like deglaze the pan, and wine gives a nice flavor as well. You'll find wine in a lot of risotto recipes. When you put it into the pan to start, it's gonna cook off the alcohol, so it won't taste like wine. So as soon as this guy has fully melted, we don't want to brown it. I want that to be nice and hot. I think another great sort of trick I've learned is like get your pan hot and then get your fat hot, and then add your stuff. So instead of putting it all there together, like don't put the onion in when the butter is still cool. You want that sizzle when your onion hits the pan, both because is there anything more satisfying than that sizzle, but also that's just kind of where you want it to get hot quick and then just start cooking. Otherwise the cooking happens more slowly and it just renders a slightly different, I think probably mostly the texture and the feel. So now we're there. We got hot fat in here, good butter. I'm gonna add, I can hear it. I can smell the cipollini, like it's a different smell than a yellow or just a red onion, a big onion. It's a little stronger, like spicier, if you will. And I love it. I think it goes really well with, squash tends to be such a nice neutral flavor, and so it really will take up the flavors you add to it in a really nice way, so as long as you're adding flavors that you enjoy. So I'm gonna let that cook for a few minutes. I'm gonna get this a little hotter. This is on medium. I'm gonna bring it up to kind of medium high so that we can get a little bit, like a little sticky, a little candy out of the onions before I add the wine to deglaze it. So, and when I say that, deglazing is really just kind of pulling all the good sticky brown bits off the pan and using wine as the vehicle to do so. If you don't want to use wine, there's a number of, you can just use more broth, or you can use broth. There's no broth in here yet. Not butter. The butter is what is sticking, so particular. If a recipe calls for wine, sometimes they will be very particular about what kind of wine, but at the end of the day, like, it's okay. You can use whatever you have in your fridge. This is a Sauv Blanc. The recipe calls for a Chardonnay. It's gonna be great. We're not using so much of it that it's like so super important that we use exactly a Chardonnay. And I think you just kind of want to get more or less a similar profile. How dry is it? How sweet? You know, I wouldn't put a Riesling in here. I don't want it, you know, it's too different. But don't, my point is, don't let yourself get stopped up by very specific call outs in a recipe. This is a different rice, this is a different wine, this is a different onion. All of it's different than the recipe, and it's going to be a different outcome, but a similarly delicious is the hope. And I'm all about just using what you've got in your fridge. Okay, it's getting a little brown. I'm gonna turn it down a little bit. It's cooking really nicely and it's getting slightly brown. So now I'm gonna add my wine. I'm gonna measure this, but I might not use all of it. And I'm gonna maybe use around half a cup. We'll start with that. I don't want it to be too strong. I don't recall what was in the recipe, but I'm gonna do it like this so you can kind of see how much of it's going in there. And you can smell, I think this is always so kind of interesting, you can smell the alcohol kind of cooking off. It smells like wine, and then it has a savory smell all of a sudden. Right now I can really smell the alcohol coming off of it. I'm gonna interrupt myself because, like I said, don't let it broil longer than you want it to. I'm gonna take this out of the oven. I'm gonna go ahead and just put this directly into the pot with stock in it. While that's kind of cooking a little bit more. Got this pot right behind me. If at this point your squash is not very soft, then cook it in the broth until it's soft. And really the softness you're going for is pureeable. There's not like a terribly specific amount of softness, but I'm gonna use an immersion blender to puree it. Someone once told me a long time ago that, like, you know, every good kitchen must have an immersion blender, and I was like, whatever, it's just another thing for my kitchen, but they were right. It is so handy. Okay, so I added my squash. I just had a little bit of stock in here, not a ton. You don't want it to be super watery. I have a small pot of just stock back behind me. Like I said, we're gonna be slowly adding stock to the pot. And it's a good idea to keep your stock hot as you cook because you don't want to cool down the rice. This guy is just enough stock to kind of make a nice liquid out of it. We don't want it to be super watery. Like I said, I would keep cooking this if it wasn't already real soft, but it is. So I'm gonna blend it with an immersion blender behind me. This is kind of perfect timing right here. I have a really, like, almost all of that liquid has cooked off. And the butter is just in there doing its thing. So I'm gonna puree this right here. Here's my immersion blender. We've got our squash puree. I don't know if you can see it in there. It's a nice puree. we are agreeing that it's like a very creamy squash. So I'm loving the texture of this. I can see why risotto was the recipe Chef went with on this one. I can also see why it would be great in a pie. Like I said earlier, some squash you'll find has a grainier texture, which I love. I like that. I use that for soup a lot, and I just add a lot of broth and stock to make it a little bit more watery. This is ready. This is obviously a much deeper pot than you need, although when you use an immersion blender, it's a high splatter factor, so the deep pot is kind of handy in that way. Over here, I'm just gonna add I rinsed this quite a while ago, which is actually probably a good thing because it's dry. So I'm just gonna add all of my rice to the pot. I'm gonna toast it. And you can see how much onion I have in here, the amount of it. The rice is obviously going to expand quite a bit, the onion will not. I have a ladle here. Also in the recipe in our book, he uses, instead of a specific amount into this pot, like ladle by ladle, which is poetic and nice, and we'll go with that. I think that's a half a cup or something therein. You're gonna wanna add just enough each time to cover the rice, and it's gonna soak up the water, then you're gonna add more, it's gonna soak up the water and the puree, you're gonna add more. We're gonna do both stock and puree every time. Know your cooktops and adjust accordingly. This is another thing where I think recipes can trip us up a little bit. If it says medium high and you have a stovetop like mine, you're just gonna burn everything, which I've certainly done. I wanna get this a little toastier. There's no liquid in this. Most of it cooked off, and the rest of it is just being soaked up by the rice. I just want this to toast a little bit more, so I'm gonna flatten it out and leave it for a second. I can feel like the rice feels almost heavier. It's kind of getting a little bit sticky, so we're gonna start adding broth and puree. We're going to do, I'm gonna maybe, this is a small ladle, so I might do 2 ladles of broth. So you could say maybe 1 cup of broth, and then I'm gonna do 1 ladle of puree. Like I said earlier, I feel like risotto isn't terribly complicated, it just requires vigilance. Like you can't really walk away from it. So, find a good kitchen companion and have a good conversation. I don't think you need to constantly be stirring it. I think this is another idea about risotto, and maybe there are those that believe absolutely you should, but I think I like to integrate it. I flatten it out so that the liquid is evenly distributed with the rice, and you don't have any little bits of rice sticking out up top because they won't cook. It goes pretty quickly in between. This is another thing, it's not 5 or 10 minutes in between. I think it's just a couple minutes. It's like ready to soak up that liquid. You just keep an eye on it, and then what I do to check if it's ready for like round 2, use your spatula, whatever you're using, pull it back. If you see no liquid in there, then you're ready for more liquid. And that went really fast. So I'm gonna do 2 more of these. Now it's taking a little longer because it has more liquid in it. Let those sit. I have pancetta here. We'll fry this off real quick before we kind of finish. And this is what's in the recipe in the book. There are so many things you can throw on top of risotto. I often like to throw some sprouts on it to give it some greenery, a little bit of like a cold, fresh element. Crispy onions are delightful on everything. But something with a little crunch is really nice. Hazelnuts I really like. Chop them up, throw them on top, mix them in. Don't mix them in right away because you really want them to stay crunchy. I think mushrooms, like some fried mushrooms, would be really nice on top. And I'm gonna do this 2 more times, and then I'm gonna taste it. And feeling confident about flavor, but what we want to feel confident about is the rice cooked enough, and that's what we're going to taste for. Maybe you need more salt. This is the forever element that is not enough. Salt is your friend. Don't be afraid, but also be careful. It's very easy to oversalt. Okay, we're going to go again. 2 ladles of broth. And again, this broth is like really, there's not a lot of other vegetables. It's mostly celery, which I think is a nice flavor for this particular recipe, so you just want to make sure your broth is a flavor that's going to go nicely with your risotto. And I think veggie, mostly veggie, is where you want to be because it's a softer, more complementary flavor. And I think at this later stages it becomes a little more important to stir more constantly because it will stick very easily and burn. I don't want that. It's not the end of the world. I'm going to taste it to see how cooked the rice is. Not done. It's too chewy, still a little hard. Maybe one more round is going to do it. I'll do it again. I think it's just about done. All I'm doing is kind of scraping with, this is why you want wooden, is to scrape the bottom of your pan to kind of get the stuff that's sticking. And remember, we put a lot of butter in here and we got all of that squash, so it's pretty sticky. And we'll try it one more time. It looks nice and soft. Feels nice and soft. I'm gonna put one more ladle of this to pull up all the sticky bits from the bottom. It's a really nice kind of light orange color. Squash risotto is definitely my favorite risotto. So I just think it is such a nice flavor. I threw the pancetta bits into a pan behind me. Like I said, just whatever thing you like to throw on top of it. These are gonna get crispy. I'm gonna try it. If you're cooking for your family, you can use the same spoon, or you can have a jar of spoons and use a new one every time. That's perfect. Little chewy, but nice and soft, not gonna break any teeth. So I'm gonna leave it for 1 second while that pancetta gets crispy. So I just turned my burner off. It's obviously still hot, but I think turn your burner off like a little bit before you're ready to be done. It's gonna keep cooking a little bit. Like if you've ever made scrambled eggs and left them in there for a second, you're like, now they're overdone, because all it takes is 30 seconds. But I want that in this case. It's super creamy. I'm gonna add some salt. I'm just gonna do a large pinch. Nice and salty. And then I'm gonna finish it with some Aleppo once we plate it, because Aleppo is bright red and beautiful. Aleppo is, it's a chili, but it depends, I think, where it comes from. In my experience, it's not very spicy, it's more smoky, and it's from kind of the Syria region of the world. It's delicious. I love using Aleppo to roast squash. Like maybe next time I do this, I'll put it on the squash when I roast it so then it cooks up a little bit, but it's really nice in cooking or as a finisher. Urfa is the very same. This is a Turkish chili. It's a very dark purple, almost black looking. Such a good flavor, a little smokier, like super, super earthy. And so I think I'll add a tiny bit of this. I love to add Urfa to baba ganoush or like eggplant. Anytime I roast up an eggplant, it has a peppery, I mean it is a pepper, but it has like a very peppery aroma, so I don't want to add too much of it. I don't want it to take over. Add a little bit of that. Check on these guys. And then again, my heat is off before I add the cheese. You don't want to burn the cheese. So I'm just gonna, like I said earlier, I'm just gonna add this and taste it as we go so I can get the amount of cheese that I want, flavor-wise. It's Parmesan. It's Parmesan. Again, you can add whatever cheese you have. It can be Pecorino, Parmigiano, whatever cheese that ends in O that you have and you love. This is kind of the Parmesan's the classic. It does melt super nicely. I like to grate it really fine so that it just kind of integrates quickly and easily. It's a salty cheese. I'm gonna taste it. Probably add some more. I do want to taste it. I'm gonna add the rest of it. I do want to taste it, I just don't want it to be overwhelming. And this is pretty much it. We have arrived at risotto hour. It's super creamy, almost kind of chunky. I think this is gonna be best right now. It's hot. Let's serve it up like this is a perfect dish. It's kind of wide and shallow because I'm gonna plate it kind of like wide and flat. Use the bottom of You can do it however you like to do it, but I think, you know, you don't need like a pile of risotto. Better to have it more like a polenta-y kind of serving. You can see it's like holding together. It's pretty thick. I think on account of the squash. I think that is maybe one sort of difference that you're gonna see in a risotto made with something like squash versus just like a straight risotto. Like I said, I'm gonna finish it off with just a little touch of Aleppo because I love it. And it has such a nice bright red color. You can just eat this as is, add some greens. We love some greens. You can also cook greens into this if you wanted. Probably if it was a super hardy green like a kale, you could do it at the start. It'll be really wilty and you'll have sort of ribbons in there. Or if you have something like sprouts or spinach or something, if you were gonna add something like spinach, you add it on the other end when you're almost done because it's gonna get too wilty if you add it at the beginning. Nice crispy pancetta to top it off. A glass of white wine or whatever you like, a little sparkling water, some good company, and that's dinner. Side dish, main dish, whatever you like, you do you. And I hope you enjoy it.